Now that Mr. Norcross is done, we can get started. That's this hearing is now open of the joint subcommittees of Sea-Power and Readiness, and our witnesses are here today, General Lyons and Admiral Busby. Again, the topic today is on U.S. Transcom and MARAD, the State of Mobility Enterprise, and again, this is an issue that straddles both subcommittees, and as in past years, we've tried to do this on a joint basis so that when we get to markup, we're all sort of going in the same direction. Before we get started, I would like to just take a moment of privilege to recognize someone in the audience here today who is the former chair of the Sea-Power Subcommittee who's visiting the Hill this week, and that's former Congressman Gene Taylor from Mississippi. And thank you, Gene. It's great to see you here. So, good afternoon. As I said, this is a combined hearing of the Sea-Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee. Again, by way of background, the two subcommittees hold this joint hearing each year to receive testimony in the posture of Transcom and also the MARAD mission, which falls under joint jurisdiction of the T&I Committee and the House Armed Services Committee. This year comes at an important moment for several of the major mobility programs. The Department of Defense recently completed a new mobilities, capabilities, and requirements study as directed by Congress in 2017. Members of the Sea-Power Subcommittee had already the opportunity to review the strengths and significant weaknesses in that report as it guides future investment in our mobility forces. In addition, the Air Force has now accepted its first new tanker aircraft, but technical deficiencies and other issues continue to plague the program as our existing tankers advance towards near senior citizen status. On the Sea Lift side, we continue to face the challenge of recapitalizing an aging ready reserve force, as well as training ships for our state maritime academies. Unfortunately, due to the delayed budget submission this year, we do not have the benefit of reviewing specific proposals and funding levels with our witnesses today. However, I would remind our members that these two subcommittees have exercised independent judgment outside of the administration's budget proposals in the last 2 years in order to address these persistent obstacles to achieving the goal of a high-functioning mobility enterprise. For example, last year, the administration proposed cutting the Maritime Security Program by nearly 30%. The Maritime Security Program is a vital component of our military strategic sea lift and global response capability. MSP is designed to ensure that the United States has the U.S. flag commercial sea lift capability and trained U.S. citizen merchant mariners available in times of war or national emergencies. It is good value for the money, providing a fleet of 60 cargo vessels for less than a third of a cost of just one Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. The Sea-Power Subcommittee rejected the proposed cut in the fiscal year 19 NDAA, and the fiscal year THUD appropriations bill supported that committee's action. The administration also proposed insufficient funding for the National Security Multi-Mission Vessel Program, which provides training vessels for use by the state maritime academies to prepare cadets for a career in the merchant marine industry. It also proposed procuring used vessels for the NSMV program rather than building new vessels in U.S. shipyards. This subcommittee rejected both proposals, authorizing sufficient funds for procurement of one NSMV and including language restricting MARAD from procuring used vessels for the program. Due to the imminent retirements of certain Ready Reserve Force vessels, the administration initially proposed to recapitalize the RRF based on a strategy heavily reliant on foreign-built vessels. Sea-Power again rejected that proposal and required in law that Transcom provide a plan to procure new sea lift vessels built at shipyards in the U.S. While I commend the Navy for exploring options to use a single hull form to replace multiple sea lift missions, I believe the strategy will prove unaffordable. I think a more practical solution would be to take a proven, mature design from commercial market and begin building that in U.S. shipyards. This would not only be a quicker way to recap our sea lift force, but it would also have great benefits to our shipbuilding industrial base, and I would be interested in hearing your opinions on that strategy. Winston Churchill once stated that victory is the beautiful, bright-colored flower. Transport is the stem without which it could never have blossomed. I hope the hearing today will be beneficial to the members and to the public as we review the importance and readiness of our logistics forces and their central role to the success of our armed forces in conflict. And with that, I yield to my friend, ranking member, Mr. Rob Wittman, for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks so much for your leadership on this, and I want to thank my readiness colleagues also for this joint hearing. I think this venue is particularly important to ensure Congress is focusing on critical and sometimes unheralded national security concerns. Additionally, I want to thank General Lyons and Admiral Busby for testifying on the state of our mobility forces. Since reviewing this portfolio last year, one thing is certain: our aged Ready Reserve Force of 46 ships, which averaged 43 years of age a year ago, now averages 44 years of age. With no recapitalization in place and only a distant hope that the Navy will find this a priority, I continue to be perplexed as to how the Army and the Marine Corps expects to get to the future battlefield on these aged ships. Last year, the Navy proposed a three-tiered strategy of extending the service life of the existing force and procuring used vessels and preparing a new construction strategy. Unfortunately, each of these three tiers has failed to deliver. And on top of this, our logistics force has continued to atrophy. Congress has done what needs to be done in this effort and authorized the procurement of 7 used vessels to begin replacing the Ready Reserve Force. We've done the work on our end. Now Navy needs only to lift their fingers and sign a contract to begin and procure these readily available vessels. I hope that we can begin to better address this deficit issue in the fiscal year 2020. On a positive note, I am pleased to understand that General Lyons has also recognized this critical shortfall and has identified the Surge Sealift Force as his #1 readiness concern. As for aerial refueling forces, the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, also known as OSD CAPE, authored a recent assessment of the overall refueling forces force structure. In this assessment, OSD CAPE opined that the refueling force structure requirements today were the same as was previously identified in a 2013 mobility study. This is in sharp contrast to Secretary Wilson's force structure assessment, where her vision states refueling air forces represented one of the biggest shortfalls in the Air Force We Need proposal. Under the Secretary of the Air Force's plan, aerial refueling would have seen significant growth, increasing from 40 to 54 squadrons. I look forward to better understanding the aerial refueling force structure challenges General Lyons identified as his second most important readiness concern. Finally, I continue to be concerned about the modernization of our mobility forces and their ability to operate in a contested environment. While sensor nodes and defensive countermeasures exist in a multitude of our mobility platforms, I think that we need to significantly improve organic capabilities to ensure deep penetrating capabilities in a contested environment. I think that this concern is particularly acute with our tanker force structure. I look forward to better understanding how TRANSCOM expects to best posture their forces and their modernization plan to ensure mobility success in a contested environment. As I reflect on the state of our mobility forces, I think that we have made great strides in our logistics, and we constantly measure our success based on the mobilization that occurred during Desert Storm. And I am reminded of what Lieutenant General Frederick Franks, the 7th Corps commander, then responsible for our Desert Storm forces, Left Hook as it was called. In response to questions about his concerns during this operation, he indicated that if you forget logistics, you lose. My fear is that we have allowed our logistic forces to become a seam issue, and our ability to project forces in a contested environment is becoming increasingly compromised. I look forward to pursuing options that we might begin to change our mobility forces so that we might become more agile and lethal when addressing our most challenging warfighting scenarios. I thank the chairman for organizing this important hearing, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Rob. And now recognize Mr. Garamendi, the chair of the Readiness Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. Whitman, my goodness, I love your passion on this issue. I love your leadership. You've really moved this thing forward. The work that I was doing in the previous Congress with the Coast Guard Maritime dovetails directly with what we have before us today. And your work in the previous Congress really brought us forward. I'm going to read this just because my staff will be unhappy if I don't, so I'll do it. but you really covered most of it. First of all, Admiral Busby and General Lyons, thank you. I appreciate the conversations we had before this hearing, and I'm going to cover one other thing before I end here. I really look forward to this discussion, how Transcom and MARAD are poised to meet the mobility and the logistical demands of a major contingency. Those who are new to this issue, obviously not my colleagues here, may be surprised by the degree to which this enterprise requires significant collaboration within and outside the Department of Defense, particularly with the commercial sector. I'm eager to learn how Transcom and MARAD are navigating their key relationships with the military departments and, importantly, the industrial base. Moreover, General Lyons and Admiral Busby, I encourage a very frank discussion today. We're not going to dance around this issue. Obviously, my colleagues in their impassioned opening statements made that clear that they won't either. The issue of mobility is absolutely crucial. It is often overlooked, but you can't go to war without it. I really love the quotes you guys found. Those are really good. So I won't go into any more of my own quotes here, and maybe I'm not even capable of establishing one. Our ability to take the fight to the enemy is predicated on the proper functioning of the aircraft and vessels needed to move our troops and their equipment. As yet, I am concerned with the service's continuing ability or not ability to prioritize investments with combat power without sufficient regard to the required logistics and mobility assets. And so, as our witnesses are keenly aware, advanced platforms and technologies will have little opportunity to matter if we lack the ability to project that power and get it where it needs to be done. It's critical that we have robust strategy for recapitalizing our aging sealift fleet. In particular, I'd like to understand how the committee could further assist in doing that. Another issue is before us, and that's the issue of the personal property of the men and women of the military. We could probably spend several days on this issue. General Lyons, we talked about it. I told you that I would like to see your strategy and the way in which you intend to pursue and why it's the right way to do it. I won't go further into this except to say this chart that I asked you to prepare when we talked yesterday is before us. Those red X's and the yellow X's ought to give our friends with whom we spent most of the morning, the combatant commanders, a real serious headache, and indigestion. This chart represents why we are here today and what we need to do to address it. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, John. And now recognize the ranking member of the Readiness Subcommittee, Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, and I want to thank you all for having this hearing, Mr. Chairman. And today, the subcommittee will hear from the Commander of Transportation Command and the Administrator of the Maritime Administration on how well DoD is postured to meet the heavy and sustained logistical demands of a major conflict. And I've heard some great quotes from Winston Churchill and Lieutenant General Franks, so I'm going to throw in a quote, although I don't know who made it. I just know the quote itself, and that is, amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics. And I think that highlights the importance of logistics when it comes to fighting warfare and being successful. And that's why you two men are doing what you do, and that's why you're here today. While Transcom has operational control of some Air Force and Navy-owned aircraft and ships for this mission, a major contingency will require the substantial assistance of the U.S. commercial air and shipping fleet, as well as the domestic rail industry. Further, Transcom must rely on the military departments to budget for critical organic assets such as ships, planes, reinforced rail cars and ports, and commercial air, rail, and shipping industry to willingly participate in defense logistical programs. Transcom can influence but cannot direct Army, Navy, and Air Force budget decisions, nor commercial industry business decisions. We understand that there are some deficiencies given this complex system and that these must be addressed. Among these are the Air Force's aging tanker fleet and some near obsolete vessels. Chairman Garamendi made reference to that, and it's on our placemat. that are part of our Surge Sealift fleet. We welcome the witnesses' perspective on these issues and any recommendations that they may have. And finally, we understand that Transcom intends to change the management structure of the Personal Property Shipment Program, which arranges for the movement of military family household goods from base to base. While this program sorely needs improvement, any changes contemplated must be well thought out measures that provide for far better service to military families and not just change for change's sakes. And I have it on good authority now that that quote I gave was from Omar Bradley, to put things into context. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to the witness's testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Google is a wonderful thing. So now I'll turn this over to the witnesses. And again, actually, General Lyons, real quick, maybe at the outset, you could just sort of explain what the placemat is, which again, I think I agree with John. It's very powerful.
Chairman, I can. Distinguished members and Chairman ranking members, before you, you have a placemat that looks like this. It depicts the 61 vessels. 15 of them are the Surge Sealift fleet managed by the Military Sealift Command, and the remainder of the 46 are managed by the Maritime Administration. And what you can see depicted on the map here is in blue represent the hulls that exceed 30 years of age. And I only mention that because if I looked at commercial industry, the average age would be about 19 years. And so they look to start retiring their vessels about the 15-year mark, and kind of they know that the M&R on the back end is much more expensive to maintain an old ship. The red X's over the top of the vessels represent those vessels that do not currently have certificates of inspection from the United States Coast Guard. And the yellow X's represent those ships that currently require unscheduled maintenance to be underway. That's an additional 13 ships. And then I'd also point out...
Could you pull the microphone just a little closer? Thank you.
Yep. Sorry about that, Chairman. And then I'd also point out to the left of the chart represents the 26 steam propulsion ships that are in the fleet. I only highlight this because by 2021, it'll be the Department of Defense will be the sole owners of steamships underneath the U.S. flag. And by itself, steam propulsion is not an issue, but the mariners to crew and the level of proficiency that comes from the merchant marine is dwindling very, very rapidly, and Admiral Buzzy can wax eloquently on that. Chairman, what I'd leave you with here is today, if you ask me how much of our sealift capacity, particularly the 50 roll-on, roll-off ships, could we generate, as I looked at this in my update brief yesterday, that's about 65% of the capacity, which is not a passing grade. Sir.
So again, whatever order you want to proceed, be my guest.
Chairman Courtney and Chairman Garamundi and Ranking Member Whitman and Ranking Member Lamborn and distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to appear before you today and represent the incredible men and women of the United States Transportation Command. And I'm pleased to join Administrator Busby, who is a great friend of the Department of Defense and a great friend of the United States Transportation Command. Distinguished members, I could not be more proud of the members of the United States Transportation Command team. Every day they project and sustain the force globally in our global deployment networks, our transportation capacity in air, on land, and over the seas, and our global command and control capabilities combined to provide the United States with a strategic comparative advantage unmatched by any other nation around the world. We maintain this advantage with the help of our allies and partners who are key to regional access and basing needed for DoD global reach. Somewhere on the globe, at this moment, Transcom aircraft is touching down every 3 minutes. Transcom ships are underway, trains are loading, aerial refuel missions are in orbit overhead, and planes converted to intensive care units are moving our nation's ill and injured. We must never take our success for granted, as you know, and I would like to take this opportunity to point out, as the Chairman indicated, my #1 concern for the Joint Deployment Enterprise, and that is sealift readiness. As I mentioned today, our sealift fleet is able to generate only 65% of our required capacity and is rapidly approaching end of useful life. The need to recapitalize is urgent. I believe the accelerating the used vessel purchases, as Chairman Courtney mentioned, with the authority Congress provided in the last 2 years is probably the most practical way ahead. Before closing, I'd like to acknowledge the recent criticism of the Department of Defense Household Goods Program. And I'll simply say that I agree with the criticisms regarding insufficient capacity during peak and the level of accountability within the department. In consultation with the service secretaries, I've met with each of the service secretaries, I've met with each of the service chiefs, and on behalf of the department, Transcom is leading an initiative to restructure our relationship with industry in an effort to improve quality, capacity, and accountability. But I want to make sure, just to be clear, the department will never relinquish responsibility to private industry. In closing, I'm proud to support DoD's enduring mission of providing combat credible military force to deter war and protect our national security interests. Our nation relies on Transcom to respond with immediate force on short notice and seamlessly transition to projected decisive force when needed. I am fully committed to retaining this strategic comparative advantage. I thank you for your support to the department and to Transcom, and I look forward to your questions, Chairman.
Thank you, General. Admiral?
Good afternoon, Chairman Courtney, Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Members Whitman and Lamborn, and members of the subcommittees. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Maritime Administration's role in supporting the Department of Defense's strategic sea lift capabilities. U.S. strategic sea lift consists of government-owned vessels and assured access to a fleet of privately owned, commercially operated U.S. flag vessels and intermodal systems, and most importantly, the civilian mariners that operate them. Together, this group of ships and mariners transports equipment and supplies to deploy and sustain our military forces globally. However, our sea lift enterprise faces critical challenges to providing the readiness assurances needed to meet the global threats we now face. The Navy-funded, MARAD-operated Ready Reserve Force is comprised of government-owned ships and a National Defense Reserve Fleet. The RRF fleet is maintained in a reduced operating status of 5 or 10-day activation readiness to support sea lift missions during major contingencies or special tasking. When needed, these 46 RRF vessels, plus the 15 MSC sea lift vessels, provide the initial surge of sea lift capacity, with U.S. commercial vessels providing the follow-on sustainment. The current RRF fleet, as Congressman Whitman noted, has an average age of 44 years and is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain at required readiness, as you can see from your placemat. Until RRF fleet recapitalization is complete, readiness maintenance challenges will continue. The escalating repair costs and availability of shipyard facilities for emergent maintenance and near-term service life extensions are concerning. We are taking steps toward implementing the Navy's plan to recapitalize the RRF fleet, known as Sea Lift the Nation Needs. A key part of that three-pronged plan is the acquisition and conversion of used ships for the RRF, beginning with the purchase of 2 vessels as authorized by the FY18 NDAA. In January, the Navy, in coordination with U.S. Transcom, provided MARAD with the desired characteristics for replacement ships to be acquired from the commercial market. MARAD then released a request for information to identify suitable ships, and responses are due back later this month. MARAD is also working to replace training vessels that we provide to the 6 state maritime academies. These vessels are also elderly and require replacement. We appreciate the support that Congress has provided for the school ship recapitalization program, the National Security Multi-Mission Vessel. 2 are currently funded, 1 each in FY18 and 19. MARAD has implemented the acquisition strategy, and the first of the 2 new training ships is expected to be delivered in 2023. Our nation's strategic sea lift is augmented by the U.S. flag commercial vessels. Of the approximately 50,000 large ocean-going commercial vessels in the world today, fewer than 200 sail under the U.S. flag, including 82 vessels operating exclusively in international trade. The remaining 99 operate almost exclusively in Jones Act trades. These types of vessels are critical to the employment base for mariners that we need for the RRF. Congress established the Maritime Security Program, cargo preference laws, and the Jones Act to foster and develop foster the development and encourage the maintenance of a robust merchant marine. The MSP helps maintain a fleet of 60 militarily useful ships operating in international trade in peacetime and employing U.S. mariners fully qualified for sea lift operations. Importantly, the MSP assures DoD access to a critical global network of intermodal facilities and transport systems that we simply would not be able to replicate. Cargo preference laws requiring the transport of 100% of DoD cargo and 50% of other government cargoes in U.S. flagged ships supports the sustainment and readiness of our international commercial fleet and the continued employment of American mariners. Access to a pool of qualified mariners from a robust commercial fleet is essential to maintaining readiness. As I testified last year, I am deeply concerned about our ability to muster an adequate number of mariners to operate the sea lift fleet needed for surge and sustainment operations during a mobilization lasting more than about 6 months. And without question, the Jones Act is absolutely foundational to our nation's ability to maintain a merchant marine in peacetime that will be there to serve this nation in time of crisis. As our merchant marine flag says, in peace and war. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and discuss this critical portion of our nation's military capability. I appreciate your support for the men and women of the U.S. Merchant Marine and look forward to your questions.
Thank you to both witnesses. I'm going to reserve my questions till the end, so at this point then I will yield to the ranking member, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll go ahead and do the same in deference to our members to go ahead and let them ask questions. So,
Mr. Garamendi.
You guys are establishing a terrible precedent. We've got to end this practice right here. I won't take too long here. I had the pleasure of going over almost all of these questions with the witnesses in the previous days, but I think there are a couple of things that we need to get on the record here, some of which you've already talked about. I want to be very specific about how we're going to how you intend to carry out the plans that were in the last year's NDAA. You mentioned it. I want you to go into detail, Admiral Busby. If you would start that. The plan, buy ships, build ships, where are we? And as you go through that, could you keep in mind the placemat and specifically the critical ships that are absolutely necessary immediately if needed? So if you can kind of pull this together, how are we going to carry out
Yes,
the
sir.
law? Okay, thank you.
Sir, thank you. So, again, the three-pronged plan, service life extension, buy newer used ships, and build new ships. The build of the new, that's still several years down the road. The Navy is focused on doing that. I don't expect to see those ships for 5 or 6 years at the very earliest. So I'm really concentrating on the two pieces that I have that are nearest to me, the service life extensions. We are being given money by the Navy to finance some of those service life extensions. However, a lot of that money we are having to put toward getting rid of some of these X marks that you're seeing on these ships right now. We are having to, the pace of repair is outpacing the pace of service life extension.
How much are you spending on that? You're basically putting money into a sinking ship.
Well, we're so far they haven't sunk, but we're keeping them afloat with that money. I mean, a lot of the X's that you see here right now are for steel repairs. They're cropping out wasted steel in the ships that we're finding, and that are part of the ship structure that we need to ensure that they have structure before we even modernize it. So a lot of that effort is going toward there. So we're not making any headway toward extending that service life. As I mentioned in my statement, we are beginning the process of procuring the newer used ships. We have that request for information on the street right now. It's due back on the 16th of March, which will help inform us on what's out there. And we're looking primarily for roll-on, roll-off ships. The specifications we put out there were to replace those high-priority ships that General Lyons has said are necessary to move the forces he needs to move. So that's what we're focusing on right now. So when we get that response back from those RFIs, we'll have a good sense for what's out on the market and about how much it's going to cost us for a ship that's, you know, about the 15 to 18 to 20-year-old point that we're looking to bring into the force.
I'm concerned about this. Is the priority for those ships that are least likely to float, operate, or is the priority for those ships that are least likely to float and most necessary for the combatant commanders? A combination of those two.
Yeah, I think yes to everything. I mean, we're going to have to take a very good hard look and prioritize the importance of the ship by its condition. Some of these ships are in much better condition than others. Some have just deteriorated more quickly.
That's the ship condition. At the same time, there are specialty ships here. I noticed some of those are X'd out also.
Right.
Are those specialty ships then a priority because there's no other ship available if that one's not available? So I'm looking at two different criteria to establish where you go first.
Right. So the initial push and the request for information has been for the roll-on, roll-off ships. We've not begun to address the replacement of the specialty ships yet. We're looking at plans for them. We're looking at the type of ships that could be used to replace those, but
In
current
the remaining
RFI.
21 seconds, I'll just put it this way to you. There are two different criteria here. They have to be merged. And I want to be quite certain that they are indeed merged. There are these specialty ships. It may be that the Marines or someone else needs a very certain type of ship that is about to sink. And therefore, that becomes a priority. If you can't find it out there in the big world, that may have to be built. So I want to get into that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Lyons, just two questions for you, and then we'll move on to other folks. Your testimony is clear and compelling about the need to improve our national sea lift capacity to deploy Army forces overseas. And of course, in order to get to domestic seaports, Army equipment must travel by rail from their home station to the port, from port to port. Please describe how you coordinate rail travel and the importance of our rail system.
Sir, thanks for the question, because it's very important from a CONUS power projection platform perspective that we have the appropriate highway network, rail network, and seaport network that you referred to. So inside of our headquarters as executive agents for the department, we look at those very issues. So railways for national defense, for example, and we assess the suitability and the sufficiency of the connector routes from our power projection platforms out to our 23 strategic ports. And we assess today that those rail networks are in good condition, sir.
Excellent. That's good to hear. And finally, we're happy to hear that you and the military services are pursuing improvements to the personal property shipping program. At the same time, significant change to a long-standing, if flawed, system must be done carefully, especially in an industry with a multitude of small business providers. How will you ensure small business will be treated fairly in the new system at the same time as making sure our military families are treated with the respect they deserve?
Sir, it's our intent on this restructure with the commercial industry actually to present the conditions at which we can grow capacity. One of the fundamental issues we have is we have insufficient quality capacity during peak season, and the carriers really struggle with that. And so we'd like to restructure our relationship so that it's not an annual transactional basis, 400,000 transactions in a year, but it's a more longer term, and we're incentivizing the appropriate level of investment. And so what I tell industry, and some industry reps are very supportive, some industry reps are very concerned, and that's very understandable. It's a very complex enterprise. But what we want to do is grow capacity, not shrink capacity. I need as many, if not more, moving companies out there providing quality service at the curbside, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Doug. Mr. Norcross.
First of all, I want to thank the ranking member and the chairman from Sea Power for diverting their questions. The other chairman will have to work on that a little bit. But
Sir, you're also a chairman, and I'm sure you'll waive yours too.
We'll work on that one. Obviously, this has the attention of all of us, that we can have the greatest flying fleet in the world, but if we can't get it refueled, it's a big problem. Several years ago, we had General McDougall, who said to a question I asked him, what keeps you up at night? And he said, refuelers. Well, we're still here. So, General, when we look at the news in the last 48 hours, there's some very big concerns. The good news, at least for a day or two, is that the delivery of the new KC-46 is started. The bad news within 48 hours is they came with a little extra baggage. We now understand that program is on suspension of deliveries. Here we are with another setback. What's that going to do for your scheduling for bringing in the new fleet? And in many ways, more importantly, how do you handle the existing ones that we're keeping together with tape?
Sure. Well, I think you alluded, our area refuel capability is really the lifeblood of our joint forces, a capability to project power in an immediate kind of fashion for almost, not exclusively, but the majority of our mission sets as a department. And it's from a TRANSCOM perspective, the most stressed capability in terms of levels of sufficiency are not where they need to be, and we're growing that. And I was frankly pretty pleased to see the Air Force's decision to accept the KC-46, and I know there's some issues that they're working through, and I have full confidence in the Air Force to work through those, and they're working with Boeing on a corrective action plan. But I think over time we're headed in the right direction with the investment in the KC-46, and we're also working with the Air Force to ensure that we have a dip in capacity, operational capacity, as we go through the conversion. So the Air Force is leaning forward in this. I'm very grateful for what they're doing here.
Do you think this extra tools that were left in there, which suspended it, is going to be weeks, months, until they make the corrective action?
Sure, I don't have a sense for that. I'll defer to the Air Force, as they work the corrective action plan with Boeing. I completely trust their level of expertise to make the right decision.
Are they giving you any indication? Because you're the one who has to make it work.
I am. I mean, our air component, General Marianne Miller, is phenomenal. She's the head of the Mobility Air Forces. We talk frequently, obviously, and I have full confidence that they'll get to the right solution set, and we're flying safe airplanes.
Thank you. Admiral, you mentioned the Jones Act, and that has been the backbone in many ways to keep what little fleet we have going. There are some discussions now for Puerto Rico, and they waived the Jones requirement right after the hurricane so we could get all the help we could get, which most of us understand. But now with the switching to the LNG for power, they're looking to get a waiver from the White House for up to 10 years. I'd love to get your view on this and what this means for the future of those you'll need.
All right, thank you for the question, sir. As you rightfully cited, Jones Act is absolutely foundational, and we in Department of Transportation and Maritime Administration particularly are we're going to live and die on the Jones Act. There are provisions in the Jones Act for waivers. They're very specific. Has to be for national security impact. We're aware that the waiver has been requested by the governor. That has to be evaluated based on impact to national security, and I think that process is working its way through the system. It has not come to MARAD yet, so if there's a case to be made, it'll have to be made.
So in your view, would it be a positive step for the executive order or a negative step?
Well, again, if there is justification for such a waiver, we'll have to just make
I shouldn't put you in that position against the president. We know how critical this is. I'll leave you with one bit of good news. Each of us had the honor of making recommendations to the different academies. For the first time, the highest number of applicants were for the Merchant Marines.
I'm happy to hear that, sir.
So it will only take another 10 years to get them experience.
I was appointed from New Jersey myself.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to talk about the issue with regard to STEAM and education, if you will. I think we have 6 maritime academies in the United States. And my question is, because this issue of STEAM is something that's been brought to us before, are we mandating that students take classes in this area to graduate and with a degree from those academies?
Yes, sir. All of our graduating third assistant engineers that have unlimited horsepower licenses, so all of those that are coming out of the 6 state maritime academies plus Kings Point, all have STEAM endorsements when they graduate.
But if I can follow up with that a little bit, it's not the issue, I don't believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason we have the yellow marks on the ships is not that we don't have somebody who's capable of operating that ship from a captain standpoint. Is it not from a maintenance standpoint on the steam turbines?
And
and
it's
the
not
gears
just, so far we have sufficient steam engineers,
Okay.
as we sit it right now, to operate those ships and to fully man them when we have to activate those ships. The challenges of maintenance are not strictly just to steam plants. There's diesel ships on here as well that are suffering the same. It's the structure of the ship more than it's the power plant that's suffering the readiness issues.
Okay, at least it appears that there's a larger percentage of steamships that are not operational than there are on the other ships.
They tend to be the older ships.
That was my next question, is that simply due to the age of the ships? I know that you're a graduate of the Merchant Marine Academy. I just want to express my support for that academy and how important it is to our national security.
Thank you, sir.
Took my kid up there to look at it, and he opted for Valdosta State University, and so they hit my credit card this morning. What about the service life extensions that the Navy is currently funding for our ships? These maintenance contracts are obviously, this isn't something that many times happens in one fiscal year, or in many cases even 2 fiscal years. Is there a way for us to do that in a more efficient manner where it's better for our contractors and for us? Maybe the multi-year appropriations, if you will?
That's a tough one to answer. We work very closely with the Navy, our funding source, and we lay out for them our proposed, what needs to be extended. A lot of the time on the ships, it's control systems for and replacement of obsolete equipment, the equipment that's not even produced anymore. So those are the kinds of things that enable that ship to extend its service life. We lay out a pace with the Navy that we would like to achieve, especially when it comes to some of the equipment that's less supportable than others. And the Navy works with us in terms of providing that level of funding back to us. And it ranges anywhere between about $800,000 to $3.5 million per ship to do some of those service life extensions.
And so I assume there's been an evaluation done on service life versus the purchase of new used, and which ones?
Right. There's a business case that the Navy is doing that we've assisted with. We provided input to some of the ships that are more critical and more difficult to replace. Some of the specialty ships, as Mr. Garamundi mentioned, that lend themselves to. They're in a slightly better condition. The idea is that we extend these ships out to 60 years in some cases, if the case is there to be made to do that.
So one last question, if I can, and following up just a little bit on what Mr. Garamundi said. Ships like the SS Cape May that move barges, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
We only have 2 of those.
Correct.
Correct. I assume we keep one on the East Coast, one on the West.
Yes,
Is
sir.
that if we needed to go to the private sector to lease a barge carrier, is that available in the private sector, or is that something that if we lost one of those ships that we would simply have to start over?
Well, we actually have a sister ship in reserve status down in Beaumont, Texas, that could be potentially used. Those types of ships specifically aren't in commercial use anymore. They're very specific, which is a heavy lift ship. There are other ships, more modern ships, that can do a heavy lift type mission. So when we ultimately have to replace these ships, it will likely be with a ship that looks a bit different but can do the same sort of mission. We're also looking at the possibility of re-engineering a ship like this. You know, the hull on these ships are pretty good shape. It's the steam power plant that's more difficult. So that's not out of the realm of possibility either.
Thank you for your time and your service. And
Thank you. Congresswoman Loria.
Well, thank you, General Lyons and Admiral Busby, for being here today to discuss this important topic, and thank you, Admiral Busby, for going through some of the details with me yesterday. I wanted to highlight first that the Merchant Marine has, since the founding of America, been an integral part of our national defense, as evidenced by the fact that during the Second World War, they suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the military, losing 1 in 26 mariners and 733 ships. So I want to thank all merchant mariners for their continued service to our nation. My focus today, I want to, in addition to the material condition we've talked about, I want to focus on several assumptions that we're making in determining whether our sealift assets are ready when we need them. There was a Maritime Workforce Working Group in September of 2017, and several assumptions were made during that working group about the availability of mariners, and the shortage of mariners was identified to be about 1,800. But we made several assumptions in that process, of which we said that a certain number of mariners would show up if requested, and that 23% of the pool of currently licensed mariners who are not sailing would be willing to come back to sea. And also a large portion of the mariners that we counted in the available pool are currently sailing with Military Sealift Command as contract mariners, approximately 17% of or 2,044 of the mariners, and they may not be available as the Military Sealift Command ships are continuing to do their mission. And so I just wanted to confirm, starting with General Lyons, that those are correct assumptions that TRANSCOM is using in order to determine the availability of mariners currently for this mission.
Ma'am, what I would say is this is where we work very, very closely with the Maritime Administration, because we rely on Admiral Busby and his team to actually work the analysis on available mariners, both underway and on the beach, so to speak.
Okay,
What I've
so-
asked our team to do is, snap the chalk line on a particular day, and let's run a TTX, see how many ships we can generate, how many mariners we can generate, and just kind of run this through the drill, if you would, so we kind of get a better assessment.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I'll actually get back to something similar later in my questioning, and wanted to ask you if it concerns you if these assumptions are not correct, the impact that it has, on sealift readiness. But with that exercise, I assume that that'll provide more clarification to be able to answer that question later. So I wanted to shift over to Admiral Busby. Other than the contractual requirement that the companies have to man the ships and get them underway, is there a specific requirement for the mariners in the commercially owned coastwide ocean-going fleet to actually man these ships?
Manning of merchant vessels is voluntary.
Okay, and is there an incentive for people to volunteer to man the RRF or sealift fleet?
I think strictly the patriotism, to want to put their shoulder against the grindstone and help the effort at this point.
So doing some math, it looks like, using the numbers that you used in your assumptions, for approximately every 26 assumed available mariners who don't show up for various reasons, not at all to question their patriotism, but some are otherwise employed by MSC and other things, that's one ship approximately that couldn't get underway to meet our sealift requirements. And so I just wanted to confirm again, I know we've already talked about the 60% availability based off material condition, but can you say with full confidence that you will have enough mariners to get the sealift ships underway if they were called to respond today?
Well, with full confidence, 100% confidence, I can't give you 100%. And what I
Okay.
can tell you is when we did that report, ma'am, labor was very heavily involved with that. So they provided their insights, they provided their views on the numbers and how many people they felt would respond. So they have given us fairly good confidence that the numbers we have come up with we're pretty confident we can get all the ships initially
I understand.
banned.
In the interest of time, I'm going to continue to the last part of questioning, but I do understand that you're taking a closer look to make sure
And we have a
of the
survey.
confidence of that data. So shifting back to General Lyons, your staff and your component commands, when they conduct sealant contingency sourcing solutions for our different O plans and COM plans, they base that on a specific sea day. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Okay, so when you do contingency sourcing and you take into account the MSP and Visa ships on that sea day, do you use an assumption of a time frame? Is it 10 days that you use to determine when they would actually be available?
We do have a set of assumptions. Wouldn't necessarily discuss it in the open forum, but I'd be happy to come back to you and take that for record, ma'am.
Okay, I just wanted to get it sort of, we make this assumption and, there's the personnel assumption, and then again, the where in the world are these ships when we need them assumption and the time distance to get them available to respond when we need them.
What I'd say, ma'am, I think you're scratching the right issue. It's the Mariners first, because I need the Mariners first to rotate the gray hulls out, and then I'll get to the commercial ships.
Okay.
I
Okay,
apologize.
I understand I've run out of time.
Yeah. But we may actually have a chance for a second round, so, but thank you. Mr. Cook from California by way of Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is like part two, I hate to say it, deja vu all over, of a committee hearing we had last year. And a lot of us, it was probably one of the more contentious hearings we had. And it was about the KC-46 and a lot of the problems. And I have to apologize for my colleague to the left of me. He was out of control in some of his questions there. Anyway, it's. I think this really scares me. And by the way, comment Omar Bradley. I don't know if there's anyone in the room here that has met Omar Bradley except me. And that's a reflection of my age. I was a second lieutenant. It was May 1967. He didn't smile once. He was yelling, I was yelling, and the subject was Operation Union on 15 May 1967. I remember everything about that. I can't remember where I put my cell phone, my glasses, this and that, but I remember those things. But he was absolutely brilliant because we had some issues with the M16 and whether my conversation with him, I think it kind of changed the whole progress of a weapon that when it was initially fielded had all kinds of problems. Anyway, this. A number of years ago, and some of my colleagues in the past on the dais might have remembered that we always had issues getting the military budget passed. We had the sequester, which I think did a lot of damage to a lot of people in this room here, and I can see the groans already. But we finally got a number of people, and I won't mention who it was, to talk about readiness. And when they started actually saying that units were C3 and C4, not combat ready, it had an impact on me as a former military. It had a lot of impact. Hey, you're sending troops off to combat, sailors, what have you, and not combat ready. And I'm looking at this, and I'm saying, if you marry this up with the op plans and the dependence upon, for whatever reason, you might as well rip up the op plans or just, put C4. It's not going to happen. And I think we've got to be very, very candid in that. And to be very honest, the reason I'm mentioning this, I think it would have a sense of urgency from Congress in terms of correcting this, because I don't think we can carry out those various op plans that these ships here are supposed to take care of. They're not going to show up. We got enough problems, and we kind of beat up the Air Force on refuelers, and that's another part of it. But this is really, really scary. And until I think we start applying readiness indicators to how all these variables, which I don't think we're being honest with ourselves. And as somebody who's just, these guys have heard, I'm just a dumb Marine who's a grunt, but I was also a logistician, and I was also a Marine plans officer. And when you have so many of these plans, you got to be realistic, because it puts what your job, Admiral. I don't know how you do it, and General Lyons. I don't think we as Congress have done a good enough job of taking care of some of these deficiencies that you have had the courage to highlight. And so what I would suggest is that whether we can apply readiness indicators to this situation, whether it's combined with LIFT, in this case, the ROROs and the ships and everything else, with the op plan. And right now, I have the feeling that every one of them is C4, not combat ready to be able to sustain that op plan. Any comments on that? I'm sorry, I did all the talking.
Congressman, thanks. I appreciate your insights. It does create a challenge. We rely on a certain level of capacity to meet the O plans that you reference, and this is not where we need to be. I would say a couple things, though. I give a lot of credit for the United States Navy right now because they're diving into this in a big way. I think it's going to be a challenge, though. I think to Admiral Busby's point, like the three-phase plan, right? The service life extensions are not returning the investment that we thought. So it's a very old ship. It's a very old platform. This didn't happen overnight. It's been building for many, many years. And then you flip to the new build and you look at the investments that the Navy has in the out years. It's very, very hard to compete a Sea Lift new build that's 26 times as expensive as an acquired used solution. And I would just encourage the committee to, because from my perspective, one of the things that's really going to be an obstacle for us is the hook for those 5 vessels in last year's bill is for the Navy to produce money in their program for a new build. I think it's going to be very, very difficult for them, given the other combatant growth that they've got to contend with.
Thank you, General. Yep. Mr. Golden.
Thank you very much. Just want to take a moment, sir, and say I'm also just a dumb Marine grunt, and it's never wanted to be anything but. And, yeah, that's right. Well, yeah, it's an honor to be here serving with you, sir. So, thank you. Thank you for your Semper Fi. Sir, I just wanted to, I'm sorry, Admiral Busby, wanted to talk a little bit about the Mariners programs and the workforce. Being from Maine, we have Maine Maritime Academy up there. And I think Congresswoman Loria and others have already broached the subject, but I thought we could just dig further, beyond whether or not you think you have the capacity you need right now in terms of Mariners to get this job done. What are your concerns beyond that down the road, looking into the future? What's the shortage look like? And I know that you work with the maritime academies. I assume that you'd like to see more people going, and it sounds, Congressman Norcross said it looks like that's moving up, but I'm sure it's not enough. But are you working beyond the academies with, let's say, other institutions that are out there in high schools or just a level above in fishing communities? Because I can tell you that there's a lot of people out there growing up in fishing communities where the fishing opportunities are not as great as what they used to be. So I'm just curious, what are you doing, or what can we do to help you?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Obviously, our academies are our key source of injecting officer licensed labor into our U.S. Merchant Marine. But to your point, we are working at additional levels, different avenues, vectors, to get people into the Merchant Marine. Last year, Congress passed legislation that establishes domestic centers of maritime excellence. It's going to allow community colleges and technical colleges to be designated as maritime centers of excellence, their programs, so we can use those as accession sources to bring people not only into the deep sea merchant marine, but also into the Jones Act domestic merchant marine as well. And we're working through the process of how we would qualify those institutions. We expect to have that out probably a little bit later this year on how to enroll those. To your point, though, we're also working at the high school level. We're reaching out. I visited the New York Harbor School up in New York, the school in Baltimore, the school in Philadelphia, school in Cleveland. There's lots of young folks that are interested in pursuing maritime careers. We're going to do our best to try and nurture them and bring them on board.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that, sir. You know, I was just working with Congressman Don Young on a bill that has to do with establishing programs in high schools for young fishermen.
That's great.
And making
Thank you.
sure that the interest stays, you know, peaked, because when they don't see the opportunities, I think they start looking elsewhere for a career. So, you know, I would encourage you to keep looking into that. It's a Skippers program up in Maine is the one, and it's geared
aware of
towards,
that, right.
towards helping lobstermen and others. But, I mean, they're doing great things like building simulators so that, you know, young 16-year-old men and women can learn how to steer ships. You know, these are lobster boats, but maybe you can do something similar with merchant marine vessels as well.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Golden. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I really appreciate Ms. Luria bringing up the number of merchant marines we lost in World War II, because Admiral Busby, you remember last year we talked about my Uncle Jack was one of them.
Yes, sir.
And all hands on his ship went down when the German U-boat sank it. I do worry about the level of attrition that we could face if we got into major conflict. You and I talked about that last year.
Sir.
I do want to kind of get an update from you, because we had a really good discussion about that. You know, earlier this week, the President, I think, took a good move when he issued this new executive order, which makes it easier for our active duty sailors to more easily transition their maritime certifications to service in the Merchant Marines after they leave active duty. And that's a good move on his part. And I know we talked a lot last year about some of the things you were doing. You've talked about them today, but other than supporting the Maritime Security Program, the Jones Act, what specifically can Congress do to help you beef up the number of merchant marines we've got out there?
Thank you for that, sir. And I think the area where we can generate the most and the fastest and the most increase in merchant mariners is to give them more places to work. That means more ships under U.S. flag. That's how we're going to get more merchant mariners, quite frankly. They're not, a number will join, but they have to have some place to work. If there's no place, if there's not enough seagoing billets for them to participate, they're not going to come in. We can have every program we want in the world, all good, and we will likely see some growth in the Jones Act fleet because we're increasing our maritime highways and that sort of thing. But the unlimited licensed people that we need to man these sea lift vessels, you know, they have to have those unlimited seagoing jobs to work and advance in. You know, we bring in over 1,000 people every year through the academies, the 6 state plus Kings Point, that come in to fill out the ranks of the Merchant Marine. They're not staying, by and large, beyond, you know, they're not making a full career because there's not a full career in many cases for them to have because of the 82 ocean-going ships that we have now, plus the 99 Jones Act ships, doesn't leave enough room for all of those people to continue to move forward, and the rather onerous requirements that now are in place for licensing take up a lot of money and a lot of time. And as young men and women get to the 7 to 10 year point in their careers where they're getting ready to make that jump to the higher license levels, the more senior people that are going to be the chief engineers and captains, they're not seeing the upward mobility. There's only so many places for them to go, and if they don't see the growth, they're going to do other things. So getting more ships under U.S. flag is really kind of the key here.
Yeah, well, we talked about the Jones Act last year, and that sometimes is a point of controversy here in Congress. And sometimes I have to point out to my colleagues that what we're really talking about here is a matter of national security.
Absolutely.
If we don't have our own people to man our own vessels, we're relying upon people from other countries and other vessels from other countries to take our troops, our equipment, our material, our supplies to places where we are in potentially major contest. So I appreciate your giving us more of that, and I hope you will continue to provide that to us. But we're going to need that to continue to communicate to our colleagues the need that we have with regard to that. So thank you for that and continue to provide that information.
Thank you, sir.
General Lyons, what Representative Cook was talking about was we had a hearing last year with the Sea Power and Force Projection Subcommittee with the Air Force about the tanker. And this was before the tanker had been accepted. And we registered with the Air Force, all of us, bipartisan, a lot of concerns about where we were. We were assured by the Air Force that they would not accept that aircraft if it had unremediated substantial deficiencies. And what I'm told is that we did, that they made some changes, but they did not adequately remediate. And so we've got an aircraft that's 2 years past its delivery date. It's not meeting the specifications in the contract. And now we have this new problem that things have been left in the aircraft, a part of the manufacture of them. And I know you're relying upon the Air Force. I understand that. You don't have a choice about that. You have to. But I'm just making sure you hear from us what we told the Air Force last summer. Now, we desperately need these tankers. I got that. And we've got to get them in. You need them very much. And it bothers me that we've got airmen that are up there with these old aircraft. But I just want to make sure you heard from us the concerns that we had expressed to the Air Force last year, and hope that will be reflected back. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was interested in Monday's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Mark Halperin, America's Inadequate Military Sea and Airlift. It is a requirement that we be able to provide the logistics to get our forces to where they are. As a young platoon leader, company commander, battalion commander, brigade commander, you know, we used to always have these great operational plans, and they all started at the LD, the line of departure. But you know what? You got to get to the LD before you can fight. And so what I found over a long military career is if we didn't practice uncoiling from a tactical assembly area, if we didn't practice doing a tactical road march to the LD, what happened is we didn't have the right forces there when we hit LD. And guess what? The enemy has a vote, and he's not going to wait on you to get your forces in line. We have that same scenario planned out right now on a strategic level, and that is with sea and airlift to get the right people in the right place at LD to fight the fight at the right time. So it is critical that we get this right. And this is for Admiral Busby. How many foreign flag vessels were contracted to transport fuel over the last 12 months? And I'll take percentages if you have that.
I will have to get back to you on that. I don't have that number right at my fingertips, sir.
Estimates that I've received are in the neighborhood of 2/3 of the fuel transport contracts are going to foreign flag ships. That's concerning.
Sir.
If we have to fight today, we can't do that if we're relying on someone else to deliver us fuel into a high-intensity environment. It's got to be U.S. flagships. It's the law that U.S. flagships get priority for transport. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes, sir.
Then why are foreign flag ships getting the majority of fuel transport contracts?
Primarily, that's, I can answer that anecdotally. Military Seal of Command typically contracts with DLA to move that cargo. Fact is, there are only 6 U.S. flagged tankers trading internationally right now. If they happen to be in the right position and positioned to carry that cargo, then they will get it. Typically, they, however, are not in position.
Okay. Is there a system online that provides U.S. shipping industry with a future projection of what contracts will be open for bid 30, 60, 90 days out in the future so they can actually project and plan to have the right ships available at the right time?
I am not aware of one that goes out that far, sir.
Would that be a pretty good idea?
That would certainly help U.S. flag carriers to plan. Yes, sir.
You know, and I can tell you from dealing with Strategic Air Command and C-17s and KC-135s and 46s, there's a lot of fleet management that goes on, and you guys do fleet management. And so when you give those contracts to someone at and cut out Guard and Reserve, or you cut out our Maritimers, they can't maintain their ships because consistency of contracts and knowing that there's going to be contracts allows. And I can guarantee you, if they know what they're planning for, that this chart changes, because if they know they're going to have the shipments, they're going to have a crew and they're going to have the ship ready to do. But if they don't know and don't have any consistency, then there's no need to get a ship ready that may or may not sail. So I'll tell you, I think the fleet management is critical, and we have to make sure that we're using the right sources, whether that be our peacetime maritimers, our U.S. flagships, or whether we're talking about our Guard and Reserve C-17s and KC-135s and 46s, because if we don't do that, we lose. And I don't think there's really a response I need on that. But next, General Lyons. We've all heard about Transcom's plan to privatize DoD transportation of household goods. And we've all seen recently what blind outsourcing has done to the military housing industry. And so what studies or what reports or what things do you have in place to ensure that we take care, because first and foremost, we owe our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines the ability to move their goods without waiting on that. What have you got in place to make sure that we don't take advantage of those guys?
Well, Congressman, to be clear, there's no plan to privatize. Everything we do, every task in the household good industry is done by industry. It's just that the relationship with industry is about 950 transportation service providers to one. And each service.
Real quick, I only have 10 seconds, and you don't have time to answer this, but I'm curious about how the same companies that you already use and adding another layer of process is going to improve it. So if you can answer that one for the record, and I know you can't now, my time's expired, but thank you, General Lyons.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to both of you for being here. You know, if you can't get to the fight, you can't fight, as you've heard several people say. And Admiral Busby, you made the comment, the pace of repair is outpacing the pace of SLEP. So would you just elaborate on that just a little bit more so I understand exactly what you meant, please?
Sure. Thank you, sir. We provide estimates to the Navy on what repairs we need to do on our ships on an annual basis, dry dockings that are required by the Coast Guard, other scheduled maintenance that must occur. In the midst of that, we also factor in planned upgrades to do the service life extensions, things that we want to do. So we get a budget, a chunk of money to kind of do that. As we go through and inspect our ships or have Coast Guard inspectors come aboard, we're discovering that there is a lot deeper level of repair that's required. And when we put those ships into dry dock, we're finding and dig into tanks and dig into areas you don't typically get to.
Okay, you got to the level that I needed to make sure I understood. So when we think about, what Congress is going to do, like it always does, it listens and it tries to provide, the appropriate amounts of money that can be effectively utilized to get the readiness capabilities that we know we need. Is there... DOD, among others, they don't happen to, have the corner on this market. But because of my experience in DOD, I've seen enough of it where we continue to spend valuable limited resources on legacy systems, or in this case, old ships, and we add $1, then there's another $1, and we don't have a plan defined enough to do that transition to next gen or new ships. It's kind of like I drive a fleet of old cars, and I promised my wife I wouldn't put any more money into one of my oldest favorite trucks, but I love it. And but the point is, there will be a time where it moves on. Can you through Transcom, through whatever program, can you provide us a transition better from when it's time to stop putting money into a ship? As soon as you find something, you just say, no, we're going to stop this, and then move forward with a new ship or some other solution rather than throwing good money after bad? Is that an ask too big over a period of time here?
We work with the Navy all the time, sir, on trying to find out where that knee of the curve is. And a lot of things have to factor in.
Have we made any progress? I mean, have we got any better at it over the last 5 or 10 years?
I would like to think so.
Okay. Well, when you think about the craft, the Civil Reserve Air Fleet is fairly well defined. We know what assets are out there. If we need in a rush to grab that, that's by contract. And I would suggest to you somehow, whether it's building other ships, whether it's having contracts, as we've already talked about here with other carriers, that some derivative of that will help us plan for you to provide us the assets that the military needs to prosecute the fight. And what I heard was said was, if we have more ships under U.S. flags, we'll have more jobs. We'll have more jobs. We'll have more career-level jobs for the 6 maritime academies as they exist now, plus Kings Point, to bring the young men and women into a vital field that is spectacular. In fact, in Traverse City, Michigan, the Maritime Academy there, I was just with them, a couple of weeks ago, and they are motivated. These young men and women are so excited. So with that, thank you for what you do, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Bergen. Mr. Gallagher.
Just one quick question. We clearly have a sea lift problem, both a people problem and a hull problem. How do you assess the potential for autonomous ships like Sea Hunter to help us solve that problem?
I would say the place that will be able to help us soonest, or at least what I'm thinking about, is in terms of assisting our sea lift ships to get to their destinations in a contested environment. We probably are not going to have enough naval vessels to provide escorts for all the sea lift ships. Try as they might, they're going to be busy doing lots of things, and the amount of ships that we're going to have to be transiting through. So having autonomous vessels that can help with the defense or escort of some of our ships, I think, has real near-term applicability in terms of how soon we're going to see, the big ships themselves autonomously going across the ocean. I don't think that's going to happen in the real near term. I think, if anything, it'll be phased over time. There are a lot of obstacles yet to be dealt with before we get there, the least of which is, just the security of the cyber security of operating such a vessel, the position finding, how we're going to conduct that vessel across the ocean in a way that its position finding won't be interrupted or corrupted, and taking that ship off course. There's all sorts of concerns that go along with an autonomous sort of vessel, not to mention just the labor aspects.
Okay, appreciate it. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. So for a ask first, I'm yielding back more time than I've consumed.
It is duly noted. Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 3 questions for you, one dealing with the ships and the other with the KC-135, and one about logistics. I hope we can talk fast here. But start with you, Admiral Busby. In trying to sort through my notes here, and if you could clarify where we're at in getting so that we can replace all of these ships that have issues. So from fiscal year 18, looks like we authorized and funded 1 new ship, the National Security Multi-Mission Vessel. And then we also that year allowed procurement of 2 foreign-built ships. And then fiscal 19, looks like a 2nd ship was authorized and funded, the National Security Multi-Mission Vessel. And then we also gave the Navy 5 additional used ships authority. And then 2 new ships for the Ready Reserve that are going to be delivered in 2026. So I'm just trying to, do we have a plan to keep moving forward? How many ships do we need a year? What's the combination of new versus used versus, I know that the Secretary of the Navy had a 3-phase program, service life extension. General Lyons, you mentioned that a little bit, how they're having difficulty with that. It goes back to the question of General Bergman. When do we scrap that idea and say, this isn't worth the money, we need to be investing in more used? It sounds like, General Lyons, from your comments earlier, you think we get more bang for the buck from getting foreign-built ships versus building them here. So what mix? Do we have a grand plan where you're asking for so many foreign built, so many used, so many brand new, and at what point will we be able to say we've replaced all these X's?
Ma'am, we do. We do have a plan. Navy has a plan, and they've presented that, a combination, as you mentioned, service life extension, used, acquired, and the authorization bill gave 5 additional, but that's also hooked to a new build. And that's really fundamentally, I think, the sticking point is the affordability of a new build. And the plan is based on the waterfall chart that ages these out in about 24 to 26 timeframe. The placemat in front of you just depicts a readiness problem today, immediately. And so what I'd like to see is I'd like to accelerate the acquired use strategy, and you know that could be at the expense of new build. I think the Navy's got some other bills they've got to pay.
So did you say 2024, 2026, when you think will be all replaced, all of them?
Ma'am, I am not optimistic on that. I'm just describing that's when you get the big age out. We've got to put some actual dollars into this and start delivering, I believe.
But the Navy plan, what does it have where we will have these all replaced? What year?
Well, in the program, the money that's there today is for the first 2 acquired used in 21 and 22. And then we've got to really work through the issues because they've got some fundamental issues financially to figure out how they're going to pay the bill.
And ma'am, if I could just jump in, the Navy is doing a business case analysis right now on the right mix and timing. But I think at the most optimistic estimate, this is like a 25 to 30 year program to get this entire fleet turned over under kind of current funding levels and current path.
So I look forward to maybe the plan's already there, but seeing maybe some options that you would have for us in Congress where you show us option A, we'd have this combination of new versus used, whatever option B, and then it'll be up to us to decide how we spend the money and what we decide that combination should be. But I agree with you, we need to accelerate this as soon as possible. So moving on to the KC-135s, and with our, peer contested environment reality that we may have with the great power competition, what type of modernization do you see that we need with the KC-135 force structure?
Ma'am, I think you realize the average age of that plane is about 57 years old, and it's going to be in the fleet probably for another 20 years. And so the Air Force is investing more money to improve the readiness of the fleet. And then with the delay of the KC-46, they're also working perhaps to delay some of the currently planned retirements, at least to retain some level of capability for the combatant command. And the rest of the details, I'll really defer to the service on that.
Okay, since I have 23 seconds, I'd just like to ask for the record, there's a concern with this logistics move going to one agency as well. It sounds like you're going to draft a proposal next week for that, but if you could let me know, how would a new sole source contractor specifically improve on areas where data shows needed improvement? And secondly, how will a sole source contracting model create more capacity, trucks, warehouses, labor, when the contractor would have to rely on the same underlying network? So thank you very much. You're back.
Thank you, Ms. Hartler. So it's now back to myself and Mr. Whitman, and then we'll have the first pass-through completed. And I'll just have a couple questions here and then yield to Rob. Admiral Busby, as you note in your testimony, the Maritime Security Program is critical to maintaining a surge sea lift capacity with U.S.-flagged, U.S.-crewed vessels. We've heard from participating carriers that long-term advanced reauthorization of this program is important because they have to make investment decisions which stretch out further than 2025.
Right.
And I guess there's also a reimbursement issue in 2022 that I think is also creating concerns. So I guess for the record, can you state whether you would support a long-term reauthorization of the Maritime Security Program as sort of a to-do item for the subcommittee this year?
Yeah, I think it would be to the program's benefit and to all of our benefit to get that under our belt, to get that reauthorization completed and moved on. We have to make sure that with my compatriot here from Transcom that the tenets of the program remain firm and that we're delivering the capability that he needs. So I think with that caveat, I think it's important that we could go ahead and move forward with that.
General Lyons, do you have any comment?
Chairman, I agree. I agree with Admiral Busby on that.
Again, Admiral Busby, in your testimony, you sort of alluded to the fact that you are going to be pursuing a, quote, construction manager, close quote, approach for the National Security Multi-Mission Vessel Program. Can you kind of put on the record and explain to us how this approach is different than the way the government usually procures ships and what advantages it has?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, happy to. So this was directed by Congress that we procure these national security multi-mission vessels using this method. And we're using, as you point out, a vessel construction manager, and we're actually evaluating prior to an award right now, is going to be a U.S. flag Jones Act carrier, a company who has recently built a ship in the United States, which there are several companies that have done that, recapitalized their Jones Act ships. So we're going to call upon their expertise in procuring commercial vessels, which the NSMV essentially is, to go out and contract with a U.S. shipyard to procure this vessel using commercial means. And we believe that we'll be able to see substantial savings in both time and schedule to get this ship delivered best value to the government.
Great. So again, is this an approach that you would recommend Congress to explore for other auxiliary vessel programs?
I think it has great promise. I think there's a lot to be learned. You should watch us as we execute this over the next year or two to see if it pans out the way we think it will. But I think, assuming that we do our jobs correctly, that it has great promise to be applied to other shipbuilding programs as well.
Well, and it seems like, the message here today is time is the enemy, so we've got to sort of find every efficiency and way to accelerate that we possibly can. So thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here with us today. General Lyons and Admiral Busby, I wanted to drill down a little bit more on this three-tiered strategy that the Navy has. One is to do service life extensions on existing ships, and we see from the placemat here that there are challenges with that, especially with the age of those ships and the extent to which they need to be maintained or modernized or service life extended. And the other part of that is to buy used ships, and the other part is to build new ships. The bookends of that strategy is one that there's a lot of resources that have to be expended to put into bringing up to maintenance standard and certification these old ships, and that's what they are, old ships. The other bookend is there's not capacity in the industry today to build those sea lift ships as we speak. So where we find ourselves is the number of ships that we build, or excuse me, that we buy used. Give me the perspective on the cost associated with bringing up to certification the ships here on this chart that you provided to us versus expending dollars to buy used ships. Give us the economics of cost associated with the maintenance and upgrades of existing ships versus buying used ships.
I'll go ahead and give a first shot on that, sir. Old ships that get older, no matter how much you fix them, they're going to continue to age. Other parts of them that you haven't touched yet are going to have issues. And the costs to do that maintenance just rises exponentially. There's just no getting away around it. Steel just continues to rot away. So some of these that have very special capabilities that we need to keep around as long as we can, as long as they're in reasonable shape and continue to put money into them, we will. We're going to obviously be working very closely with the Navy, and there will be a point, there will be a knee in the curve where it just makes no more sense to dump any more money into them, no matter how special those ships may be. The replacement vessels that we're looking at bringing into this fleet are, a decade or two younger than the ships they're going to be replacing. And presumably, if they're in good enough shape coming in, their maintenance costs are going to be much less, and their reliability will be much higher, and their equipment will be much more modern. Again, the business case that's underway right now by the Navy is looking at kind of where those knees and the curves are, where we're giving them a lot of data to work with on actual conditions so we can make smart decisions here. But we need to get on with it. These ships are not getting any younger, as you know, we've all noted, and they're just getting more expensive.
Very good. General Lyons, any perspective on that?
Sure. The only thing I'd say, and the Navy, to Admiral's point, is working this very right now. And what I'd say is with the service life extension, and again, I don't want to get ahead of the Navy on this, but in a couple of examples I've looked at, it's probably about 3 times as expensive as was budgeted, probably about twice the period of time, and they're not coming out of the shipyard with certificates of inspection. So in the near-term strategy is not delivering readiness. Used ships vary, 25 million, maybe to 60 million, depends on the age, and a new ship is 26 times that.
Seems like to me that it makes sense, and I know the Navy's doing their analysis, but it makes sense to not put lots of money into old ships that right around the corner are going to have more and more severe problems in order to keep them at sea. So it does seem like we need to really accelerate the purchase of these used ships. I appreciate your perspective. General Lyons, I did want to get a quick perspective on you, looking at the OSD Cape study versus the number of tankers that they say we need, which is a static number, and the assessment by the Air Force of the Air Force we need perspective that says we need a lot higher number of tankers going in the future. I want to get your perspective on where you believe the right place is as far as number of tankers in the future to perform this refueling mission.
Yes, sir. As you know, the 18 authorization directed the department in concert with Transcom to conduct a study on the sufficiency of mobility enterprise against our war plans. We did conduct that. We assessed the level of sufficiency. We did assess increased risk, significant risk in the area refuel portfolio, and we also acknowledged that the work we did was largely inside the program, so it was with the current existing planning set. But as we work that, we also understand that the Joint Staff is working updates on global integrated planning construct, and the department's working updates on defense planning scenarios. So we'll have to evolve this study as those plans and demand signals evolve.
Let me ask this. The relativeness of terms here, I think, is important. When you talk about significant risk, that's nomenclature that if you talk to folks outside, they go, well, what's significant risk? I want from your perspective and the official designation of that term, is significant risk acceptable risk?
No, sir. Department typically invests to moderate risk. Significant risk would be above that level.
So you would say that in those situations, the place where we find ourselves with tanking capability is beyond the point of where we should be comfortable with that, or where we should say that's acceptable risk?
That's correct, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi, second round.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, the placemat is very, very helpful. There's a second line here, and that is there may be a specialty ship that isn't on this mat, or maybe is on this mat, that is desperately needed. And that may be a ship that has to be built because there's no other used ship out there. I'd like you to take that analysis and get back to us on that. Mr. Kelly brought up the issue of the movement of personal goods. And General Lyons, we discussed this yesterday, and I would appreciate if, for the record, you would provide us with a detailed justification for the change that you are proposing. I understand it is soon to be underway. If you could very quickly, not the whole justification, I suspect that to be a significant document, but just the timing, where we are, and finally, also an assurance that current contractors and new contractors would be able to participate.
Sir, absolutely. I appreciate the question. This is a topic that I've received more letters from Congress than any other topic in my combatant command responsibilities. The fundamental issues at stake here really are sufficiency during the peak and accountability. This is not entirely an industry issue. The department and the way we run this program is part of the issue, frankly, a large part of the issue. And that's really what's driving our effort to restructure. I've been meeting with CEOs. I've got a meeting next week to meet with industry reps and their chief executives. We're wide open on how to shape this relationship. But today, if you were to look at the way we manage this program in the department, completely diffused, completely decentralized, every service is running their own thing. There's no enterprise approach. A carrier can be suspended over here, working over here. And so we're not doing due diligence for military families. And at the end of the day, that's really what this is all about, is to deliver better curbside service. And the idea about moving to a single move manager really is a longer term relationship than one transaction at a time, so that we incentivize a level of investment in the industry and allow industry to run industry, because right now we're over-engineering the process and it's excluding carriers that want to participate but won't because we're too hard to work with.
You've received letters, so have we, and they're coming into my office and our offices also, so the justification and the explanation would be very much appreciated. Finally, there's very few of us left here, but almost every member has expressed concern about the ability of the American shipyards to produce ships. There is a program that's underway. It's called the Energizing the American Shipbuilding Industry. The leadership of this committee, all of us, were in on last year's bill. It will soon be reintroduced, and that could lead to some 50 ships, LNG, as well as tankers being built in American shipyards with the jobs thereof. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lambourne, to be followed by Mr. Kim.
Thank you. And General Lyons, when we visited earlier, we didn't talk about pre-positioning, but I'd like to ask your philosophy on that, and if you have any goals or improvements or changes that you want to make going forward to make that an even better approach to our logistics.
Sure, thanks. That's an important part of the strategy.
Mike.
Okay, I'm back. Sir, I apologize. Prepositioning is an important part of the strategy to be able to project power. The services largely run that program in terms of how they want to preposition capability, whether it's ashore or afloat. And then a portion of the Surge Sealift fleet run by Military Sealift Command is allocated to that, for example, 15 RoRos. And those ships, once discharged, would come back to TRANSCOM for follow-on movements. So it's a very important part of being able to produce a level of agility to be able to come at a problem set from multiple ways.
Are there changes or improvements that could or should be made in our approach to pre-positioning?
So each of the services have made improvements over the last couple of years. As a matter of fact, this committee with the EDI for Europe has enabled a lot of that, particularly for the United States Army in Europe. But the other services like the Air Force have improved their positions and their posture in munitions and other areas like that. So they continually assess that.
All right, that's all I needed, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Lambourne. Mr. Kim.
I'll keep this brief just for the sake of time, but I did want to raise it. One of my colleagues, Congressman Norcross, raised a lot of this earlier. Certainly my district in New Jersey, the Jersey 3rd Congressional, is deeply affected by McGuire-Dix Air Force, McGuire-Dix Lakehurst Air Force Base and Joint Base. I wanted to just follow up here. I mean, just really stress that the corrective action plan is certainly something that I'm very interested in and want to make sure that we're following up on in a timely manner to be able to understand what's happening with the KC-46 and be able to move forward in that way. So I just wanted to take this time to be able to alert in that way and just get a sense from my own sense of what these next steps are and when we can expect that kind of timeline going forward.
No, yes, sir. Fair enough, and I'm very interested in that myself. You know, the Air Force is working this. I think they've got a good plan. They're working with Boeing on the corrective action plan. If you're talking about the near-term issue, and that'll be a decision really by the Air Force acquisition executive whether to proceed with acceptance of the continue the acceptance, restart the acceptance of the KC-46.
Okay, great. Well, look, this is a critical element of our joint base and what we're trying to get done. We are deeply concerned about anything that could affect the overall timeline and when they will be delivered to our joint base. So I just want to make sure that we're tied up in sync on this, both in terms of the short term as well as mid to long term effects on that. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. And Mr. Kim, it's very possible that the Sea Power and Projection Forces may be doing a follow-up with the Air Force again, because obviously that's sort of where the center of gravity is right now, and we'll certainly keep your office informed. So, yep, thank you. With that, I think we're, Mr. Whitman.
Just very quickly, I want to circle back around with General Lyons, looking again at airlift. The National Defense Strategy, as you know, emphasizes great power competition. It's our understanding when the President's budget comes out next week, it will also dovetail with resourcing the necessary capability for great power competition. One of those areas we talked about constantly is tanking. We see the KC-46A deliveries. We see some shortfalls with the capability of that aircraft under certain situations. And with that, we see the KC-135 is going to have to perform the tanking mission well into the foreseeable future. Give us your perspective on service life extensions on that aircraft, because we're going to continue to need it. It is an older aircraft. It's been through a number of service life extensions, but give us your perspective on what we need to do to make sure we have the fleet necessary. And of course, the number is 479. We're not anywhere near 479, which means we may need to keep some of these aircraft that had been planned to be retired, like the KC-10, KC-135, for extended periods of time. If you're going to do that, that aircraft has to be capable. So give me your perspective on what we need to do with the KC-135 fleet.
Well, sir, I just, for the Air Force, I was recently down at Tinker, where the Air Logistics Center, where they refurbished the KC-135, and it is absolutely impressive what the Air Force is doing with that model of airplane that's been around for nearly 60 years. And they'll continue to figure out how to fly that for probably 20 more years. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Air Force is looking at this across all their weapon systems, and from my perspective, it's about capability over time. You alluded to sufficiency. We are short against the objective, and we're kind of thinking that could actually grow, as you mentioned. And so the two major initiatives are to bring on the KC-46 and then to maintain the life expectancy on the KC-135, as you mentioned, and that's where the Air Force is pushing right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. So this hearing seems to be having its own service life extensions. We have been joined by another member, and a good member, Mr. Cisneros from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Lyons or Admiral Busby, thank you for being here today. Sorry I'm late, but I was at another committee hearing regarding veterans. So I actually like your chart that you have here. I actually spent time on 3 of those MSC roll-on, roll-off ships, the Obregon, the Kozak, and the Pless. I was actually stationed at MPS 1 when it was still active. I'll keep it brief because, like you said, this is we don't want to extend this any more than it has to be. But I'm interested in the, the MARAD ships and really the activation time. They just sit there, kind of collecting dust, and I know there's some people on there, kind of maintenance there that does PMS. But how long does it take to get one of those ships active, up and running?
Sir, they are required 96 hours to be ready to be underway.
Mm-hmm.
And we exercise that annually on a fairly regular basis, not the entire fleet, but General Lyons activates us, gives us no notice, starts the stopwatch, and it's a dead stop to go, to be ready to go, and it's graded. So we have pretty good confidence, that these ships can do it and do it reliably. I would just point out that I have 4 of my ships currently underway right now doing missions, and they have had no casualties whatsoever. They started on time, they went out, and they've done their missions flawlessly. So 4 days to be underway. They have to, be ready to report on the 5th day.
Now, with the shortage of merchant Marines out there, are you finding it difficult on 96 hours really to staff a whole ship?
So far, we have done extremely well. We actually do an annual exercise, which we just finished up to kind of do a paperwork drill to make sure that we can actually source bodies. We work very closely with the unions on that. This past September, we did a kind of a mass activation of 13 of these ships all at once, and we had no problem manning them up. The shortfalls that we talk about are typically that we would see 4 to 6 months down the road if we activated all of them. We typically have enough people. We may have a spot shortage here or there for a specific skill set, particularly on the steamships, because that's the shortest skill set. But by and large, manning on these smaller scales is not an issue right now.
All right. And then when you activate these ships, you said we have 4 active right now.
Yes, sir.
Are we rotating those ships to make sure it's not just the same ships that are
Absolutely.
always active?
Yeah, it's really by mission, what's required, what the requirement is for that particular mission, because these ships have different square footages, they have different deck strengths and deck heights, so it's what's required by the mission. But we typically don't go to the same ship constantly. We do mix it up, and it's by coast where it's required.
All right. And what is I know some of those ships are reaching their age limit as well, yeah, like you said, they're extending their life. I'm sure you probably answered this question already, but how long is it actually going to take us to replace all these ships?
The current Navy plan goes out about 25 to 30 years before we have a full replacement of this fleet. And that's through a combination of service life extensions out to age 60, through replacement with newer used ships, and through new construction ships.
And the steamships are first on the list?
Steamships are going to be right up there, except for there are a few that are special mission type ships that may require them to stick around a little while longer until we can get the proper replacement for them. But they certainly are going to be a priority just because of the manning that goes along with them.
All right. Well, thank you for being here today. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cisneros. I think we've done it, and I want to really thank both witnesses for your patience and thorough answers. And though I'm sure there'll be some follow-up. And again, we're definitely interested with the MARC this year in both subcommittees, I'm sure, in terms of trying to do everything we can to help achieve the goal here. So again, just for the record, I'd ask for unanimous consent that General Lyons' chart be made part of the record.
Can we also put these charts in?
And we have, I guess, additional charts. Okay.
If I might also, for the record, add charts that Mered has passed around for some time. This is a more complete display of all of the ships that are in the Ready Reserve Fleet, as well as those that are on the Maritime Security Program.
Great.
And
Any
they're
objection?
useful. Thank you.
Hearing none, we'll have those entered in the record. Again, thank you to both witnesses, and I hereby order this hearing closed.